Welcome to the fourth video on the race car project. In this video I'm going to be going through with you how to remove these sections of waste on the front and back of your race car. And I'm going to be going through and showing you and teaching you a little bit about smoothing plane in the process, as well as using the chisel for non-trench work on your project as well. Okay. Before I can get going on this, there's some things we really need to think about when it comes to using tools with cutting edges like these on our material. And it's all to do with the grain of the timber and the structure of the timber. So to do that, I'm going to switch out to my analogy here, which is my pile of straws. Okay. So with this pile of straws, it's like the grain, this is our end grain here, this is the direction of the grain, okay, just like it would be on our piece of wood, okay. Now because we've been going across the grain with our cutting so far, a lot of people when they pick up either the chisel or the plane to try and remove this section of their project, they want to go across the grain as well. But whereas with your trenches you cut down the sides of the grain to prevent that from happening and you are going fairly parallel to the grain, you don't have that with this angled section here. So it's not going to work out the same way. I just want to show you what would happen. I'm going to pretend my finger here is the chisel or the blade on the plane. Okay, and I'm going to go this way and try to remove some parts of it. You can see what's happening to the grain. Okay, now despite the fact my finger is only over here, okay, it's pushing all of this grain here all the way along my piece out. And it's going to, we've got what we have, what we call tear out happens. Okay, where it chips and pulls away significantly further away than where we want it to. Okay. So we can't go across the grain because it's just not going to work. Now if we go in from the end, which is what a lot of people then think needs to happen next, either with the chisel or the plane, we're going to come in this way here. We can see again, okay, as soon as I try to insert my fingers in, it just pushes it the whole way along and will split the whole way along our timber, which means you try to put your chisel in here, and it doesn't matter what angle you hold your material and your chisel at, okay, the grain fibers will still split and they'll usually split all the way down here. Okay, so we don't want that to happen. So there's a third option. Okay, we know we can't go across the grain, we can't come in from the end grain, but we can go along towards the end grain, so along the grain and towards the end grain. And you'll see that when I do that now, okay, with my pile, nothing happens, okay? So it's going to cut away rather than chipping out or tearing out any of the other fibers. So I can quite easily cut this away and it will just pare away that material towards the end grain nice and neatly and easily, okay? So that's what you need to be thinking about. Always been cutting with something like this to remove that area. Rather than going across, you're going towards the end grain, along the grain. This one here, you're going to turn it around and you're going to be doing again towards the end grain. Okay? So you've got to remember the grain of the timber changes a lot of the decisions you can make and forces your hand with what you can do. So you need to be thinking about that at all times. So we've used the chisel already, so I'm not going to talk about that too much with this. I'm going to spend a little bit of time now talking about the smoothing plane. Now you'll notice that I have the smoothing plane on an angle here, it's sitting on its side. And whenever you put the smoothing plane down, it either needs to have something underneath to prevent the blade from touching your bench or be sitting on materials, or sitting on its side. So the preference is usually just to have it sitting on its side. Again, that is because we don't want to dull that blade. Okay, you can see that blade poking out, poking out through there. Okay, that's coming in from the back here. Okay, we don't want to dull that blade at all. And if we completely shove that down on the bench all the time, we're going to end up dulling that blade. Okay, and pushing it back in as well. Every time we push it down, I mean, this will stay out as much as you need it to, provided that you're not constantly putting pressure on that blade, okay? So that's important, okay? Down like that. Now when you pick up your plane, just like when you're looking at chisel, you want to have a bit of a look down at the blade there, okay? And make sure there's no obvious dings in it. Now this blade needs a bit of change. It's sticking up a little bit too high out of the sole there, quite significantly actually. So we do need to fix that up and change the angle of it as well. But that's easy enough to do with some of the adjustments on the back end here and this little lever here. This will change the angle the blade sits at. And this here will change how far in or out it is. Now we only need it to be a very small distance out, okay? Go. That's now sitting much nicer. Now there is a couple of little dents on this, but hopefully it won't bother us too much. And just pulling the blade back in now, so it's only just poking out a little bit. And that's looking a little bit better. Okay, you probably can't see much of a difference in that, partially due to the background behind us. Okay, but very little of it sticking out at all. Again, just like a chisel, never run your hand that way. Okay, if you do need to check how far it's sticking out, you want to kind of come that way along it. Okay, really important. Okay, we don't need to have slices of your fingers lying around. Okay, now if we were using the plane to actually change the thickness of material or the width of a material, like you can do and has traditionally been done, the grain direction again is important, okay? You want to be planing in the same direction that the grain is going up in, okay? So I would want to be, the grain on this piece here is kind of going up in that direction there, and I want to be then planing in the same direction as that. If we don't get that happening, okay, we get tear out, which is actually what's going on just here. Okay, that's tear out from the change in direction when this board was planed and dressed by whichever company manufactured it. Okay, so I want to be making sure that I'm going in the same direction as it is going up. And that's a similar reason to the end grain situation going on there. So I don't know how sharp it is, but this might be testing it. Okay, when I'm holding my plane, holding it in my dominant hand, that finger pointing down the side with that pistol grip, just like before. Non-dominant hand on that knob at the front there. Opposite leg forwards, other leg back, and I'm wanting to do this kind of a movement. Okay? And I should be getting some nice shavings. This is not as nice. It's probably a slightly aggressive cut, which means I've probably got the blade sticking out just a smidgy bit too far still. Okay, when you get these nice thin curly shavings. It's a really nice kind of sound. Gives that really good woodworky feel. And if you've got the grain direction right, this piece is a bit tricky because we've got knots and the grain direction changes. So you'll actually see that it's getting some tear out on this side here. I don't know if you can see that very well actually. This doesn't like auto-focusing for me. But this side here is nice and smooth. Okay. I love the shavings. You're not going to get these unfortunately from your race car, but they're kind of fun to make sometimes. Okay, so that is your plane and how you hold it. Now with what you are doing, having a slightly more aggressive cut actually can work in our favour a little bit for us. With this, position it in the vise so that the line that you are planing to, the angle that you're planing to, is parallel to the top of the vise. Okay. I'm left-handed again, so I'm holding this and I'm going to go this way. If I was right-handed, I'd turn the whole thing around and I'd be going this way with it facing the other way though, yeah? Because we can't come in from the end grain. And it's not going to sound great to start with because I'm only going to be taking off this tiny little amount from the top corner here, okay? Now you may find that across the course of you doing this, if you're pushing down quite hard or if your plane's not very sharp or you haven't done the vice up overly tight, then you might find your project pushing down. Okay, and it could be any one of those factors. Now as you're doing this, because we are not woodworking masters, pause every now and again and just check to see how you're going, because you'll find that you'll probably angle it slightly more one way than the other. Okay, and you'll want to try and correct that. Okay. As I said, this is not the sharpest plane in the world. But you can see that as I get more of it cut down, kind of getting a flatter surface, you're hearing some of those more kind of nice planing noises, and we're getting these little tight curls because we're essentially cutting end grain rather than along the side. Okay, we're not going to get the same kind of curly shadings. Okay, remember putting it down on its side. Alrighty, so I'm not going to keep going, I'm just going to stop here, but you will keep going obviously until you're all the way down to your lines. But you can see it's leaving a relatively nice finish across the whole thing. These bits aren't quite nice, that's because the blade's got some dents in it along those sections and it's not the sharpest that it could possibly be. Okay, you hear I'm a little bit out of breath because it does take a bit of effort, okay? Alright, so that is using the plane. Now this little one here is called a smoothing plane. We have got two of them about this size. The other ones are larger, they're called jack planes, and they're better for doing what I was doing first off, which was planing a long length of timber like this. Okay, the jack planes aren't going to do this very well for you. Okay, you're better off with either a smoothing plane or the smaller versions, which are called block planes, which we don't have. Okay, so stick with just a smoothing plane. If it's not available, or you're finding it's too blunt for you, move on to the chisel, which I'm going to show you now. Okay, so I've picked out a 19mm wide chisel. Okay, and I'm still going to position my work so that my line is parallel to the vise. It's super easy to always try to work either parallel or 90 degrees to your vise. Anytime you try to work on more of an angle than that with anything that you're doing, it's going to make your life harder, and it's going to be harder to kind of gauge where you're up to as well and where you need it to be. Whereas when you know that it's either going to be flat or 90 degrees, it makes your life so much easier. Okay, so I'm actually doing this left-handed this time with the chiseling, just so that you're aware. Okay, I'm standing with my right foot out because I'm holding my driving tool in my left hand, my mallet. I'm positioning again close to the edge. I'm not trying to take large chunks out at the moment. I'm going all the way along. I picked a 19mm wide chisel instead of a 25mm wide chisel, just because the wider the chisel gets, especially when you're cutting into end grain like this, the harder it is to actually get it to cut away. So I don't want to have a super tiny chisel because it's going to take me forever, but I don't want to go all the way up to the top one either. Okay, I want to try and just evenly try to cut this away. Okay, you'll see I kind of aborted that last cut there because it was moving around on me too much. Okay, so I'm just going to give it another tighten. I did have a look at this chisel, but again, a nice chisel with no dents in it doesn't mean it's sharp, and cutting into end grain is tough on your tools. This is probably one of the few times when you're going towards end grain like this, is probably one of the few times when you can actually go all the way through your cut. There's nothing to tear out because all the fibres are standing like that. So there we have, again, I haven't gone completely. I'm not going to keep going until it's 100% done. But you can see that there's a little bit of still stuff going on because the chisel's not 100% sharp and because that end grain behaves slightly differently. So you actually need sharper tools when dealing with end grain like this. Okay, all right, so that is removing those two angled sections or doing an angled cut on a piece of material like this when it is going along the end grain. Okay, if you had an angle going along the side like that, then you probably wouldn't worry about the chisel at all and you'd probably just use the plane. Or if you're a little bit older, you might use something like the router and the router table to do that for you. Okay, all right, so that is using a plane on your race car. All right, see you in class.